Okay, we're in Colossians chapter 2. We are picking up in verse 8. I want to go ahead and read verses 8 through 10 together, just so we hopefully can get there, but to understand kind of how this is operating. And it is kind of fluid as we hit this, but I do want to tell you up front, we are now finally, after last time in verses 6 and 7, having established what is essentially the thesis of the book, and that everything is complete in Christ, and that staying rooted and grounded in Him is the answer that they need, and they ought to be thankful that they have that. And all of those things are kind of a culmination of answers to the motivations that have been floated toward them at these false teachers who have been trying to influence them, and so far have done so unsuccessfully. And that brings us now is this main part in verse 8. He's going to address the particular problem that the Colossians faced. And this continues through the remainder of chapter 2. And I've been telling you all along, so you've got a heads up about it, but this has been argued a long time about what were these people and what was the exact problem that they were encountering. And so we're going to notice some clues, and also not to be drawn off sides for some of the wording. Colossians chapter 2, beginning in verse 8. Beware, lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. For in Him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and you are complete in Him who is the head of all principality and power. This introduces the problem specifically, and he is very straightforward about it when he says, beware, look out, watch out. That's what he's saying, is that you need to be looking around with both eyes open at your problem so that you do not in any way miss some of the signs and the evidence that I'm about to talk about. And I think we take that for granted a little bit today because, can you spot a false teacher? Yeah, Kevin, no problem. Well, you don't know what the false teaching I'm talking about yet is, now do you? You realize that once we state with such great confidence that how easy it is for us to spot someone a false teacher, we're basically maintaining we got such a great grip of understanding on the Bible that we are prepared for anything. And we have to be able in those situations to realize how subtle some things are, and to be willing to recognize gaps in our knowledge so that we can study it when the time comes. Say, wait a minute, I haven't heard that. Let's get into that and study it and do it independently rather than just be led by the nose by the first person to mention something. Okay, so that's why we need to beware. It's as much a kind of a heads up to us that we need to be paying attention and not take for granted everything we have as much as anything. But the reason why is, he says, lest anyone cheat you. Cheat you. Now that's an interesting word. Does anyone have a translation that translates that a little bit differently? Oh, I like that one. Takes you captive? Yeah. I think that really captures where this word is. And I also like it because it more perfectly aligns with the other side of this when you get later on in the chapter, just a few verses down in the word triumph. So the distinction of what you have, because what's happening is, if you drop down, just to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, but when you get down, you see in verse 15 when it says triumphing over them in it, which is the end kind of the next section. Well, you have really of these two things together, going all the way from verse 8 through verse 15. In a way, he's created a contrast by using those terms. Okay? Because the concept of here, if I do like take you captive, is the idea of an army in the march, and that you are the one who is lost. Whereas he ends it with what Jesus does at the end of verse 15, emphasizing that Jesus, as basically a general, a victorious general, has won. So you get within this whole section, you get those two words kind of anchoring the ideas that are being presented here. Okay? So he starts and he says, lest anyone cheat you or take you captive. So that means that when you become a captive, that does not mean that you get set up in a nice POW camp somewhere. In the ancient world, when you were captured, you became a slave typically. Okay? And that's kind of interesting when you look at the wording of Romans chapter 6 as well. But you become a slave in that situation. So you are about to lose everything if you don't pay attention. That's what he's warning. You're going to be cheated. Now, we understand that there are high stakes. Pay attention because the stakes are high for you, not for Paul, for you. You're the one that has something to lose if you're paying attention to these people. But now we get to the more difficult part about what exactly was creating this problem. Because he says this happened, or could happen, through two things: through philosophy and vain deceit. And I think that this one word, I'm going to speak personally here, really threw me for a long time. Because you know how you get to where you'll attach a certain meaning to a word, and that will kind of move you a particular direction? I think that that's what happened, not just for me, but for years in scholars everywhere. Well, we've got philosophy, so this excuse me, this has to be some different kind of problem. So if it's philosophy, then what does that mean this is? A man-made theory. Okay, good. We're dealing with philosophy, right? We're in the ancient world. Philosophy's a real thing.
Well, we're not dealing with personality.
It's thought. Okay. What thought?
Based on what you see in the physical life. So it's empty, it's not from God, it's what you think.
So you don't think that there can be philosophy that has something to do with God?
Well, you're talking about empty philosophy. Philosophy itself means,
So it can't, if God is in the philosophy, it can't be empty. It can't be bad philosophy. Okay, yeah, I know. I'm really trying to get. It's where I'm going. Okay, I'm messing with you because of where we're going. Okay. We should admit we think of Greek philosophy, and that's what throws things off. There are two things that often happen here. We're thinking that they're adopting Greek philosophy, or what really for many years was accepted was that this was Gnostic. This was Gnosticism. This is an early, they call it incipient Gnosticism. Okay? But there's the problem. The evidence indicates that Gnosticism was barely in existence in its early stages at the end of the first century. I mean, even when we went through 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, I'd call it proto-Gnosticism then. So we're talking about 25 years before that Colossians is written. Whole generation, really. So that had been one of those things. And you know what? Here's what ends up happening. People say, well, he's clearly the problem. He's talking about wisdom and knowledge and understanding. Those are Gnostic kind of terms. And here it's a philosophy, so it's talking about Gnosticism. But problem is that Gnosticism doesn't really appear until the late 1st and early 2nd century. And therefore, Colossians was actually not really written by Paul. There you go. Just pulled the rug out from under us entirely. So we have to be aware of where some of this worked. Okay. But the next thing we need to do then to work this out is we let our eyes fall through the remainder of the context through chapter 2 and let the context tell us what the problem actually was. When we work through it, number one, you immediately it's coming to according to the tradition of men. Now that's going to be important. Basic principles of the world, that doesn't tell you enough. It's again too generic. But what's interesting is, if we just quickly move through it, in verse 11, he's talking about circumcision. If we're dealing with a secular philosophy, circumcision would be a very odd reference to be making in that context. He then comes down to verse 14, and you're talking about the handwriting of requirements. Again, an odd reference to be making if you're dealing with secular philosophy of some kind. When you come down and we get to verse 16, all of a sudden we're talking about judging you in terms of food or drink, a festival, new moon, or Sabbath. Now, the Greeks might have festivals and new moons, but they didn't recognize Sabbaths. Okay? The Jews had all those. Okay? And then you have, which are a shadow of things to come. Well, that indicates that they were in some way related. That's not Greek philosophy. Okay? Then you go in verse 18, and he's talking about, don't let no one cheat you, your reward. But here's what it is. Through a false humility and worship of angels. You don't get that. That is very specifically a problem that developed among the Pharisees in Second Temple Judaism. All right? So you go and you see that, and they're puffed up. This is then described in verse 20 as basic principles of the world, which takes you back to the idea of basic principles in verse 8, we're going to look at. Okay? Basic principles of the world, and you're subjecting. What are you doing? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. That's some form of asceticism. That is, don't allow yourself to do certain things, okay? What is it? According to the commandments and doctrines of men. That is parallel to what he just is saying about the tradition of men in verse 8. Okay? So now we come through, and what is it? These things have an appearance of wisdom. What is the word philosophy? What is it made of? What does it mean? The love of wisdom. Sophia is wisdom in Greek. Philo is love. The appearance of wisdom in self-imposed religion, false humility, and neglect of the body, which he is reviewing what he's gone through here, but are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh. Okay, that doesn't work, in other words. Basically, they said, you're trying to impose what they were doing, and we're ahead of ourselves. They were imposing okay, we're just not going to do any of this, and we're going to go into this extreme, and that's going to solve this other problem, okay, that I've got a lust problem, okay. This is the problem to deal with the lust of the eyes is all women must wear burqas, okay. Problem solved, okay. Does it solve the lust problem? No. It masked it. Okay? And that's kind of what he's talking about is the nature of this. All right. So what do we see as we went through all of chapter 2 in that preview? What did you notice about the nature of the problems? Okay, good. They're all related to Judaism. Okay, so was there some kind of Judaistic philosophy during the first century that might have caused this kind of problem? And the answer is yes. Well, since you brought it up, it was the nature. We don't have the documentation for the particular kind of philosophy. Some of that is dependent upon historical kind of evidence. But what you're dealing with, especially when you're putting together the tradition of men, this is something that has developed for them over time and that now is being used, okay? So that indicates that this is somewhat, there's some kind of standing and probably things are written down. Now, you have a couple of books within the pseudepigrapha, and it's not actually First Enoch, though that certainly has the angelology part. So when we get there, you're going to hear it again. But there are works. One is Fourth Esdras, which actually happens later, but that has all sorts of very similar thoughts to what we're dealing with here. You have before this, you have a lot of their works that would have been presenting. They had wisdom literature. Okay? The Wisdom of Solomon was one of those works. Okay, so you have a lot of this kind of wisdom literature, but you also had the Pharisees developing certain things out of trying to explain. The calendar mattered a lot to them. And so you have all sorts of arguments about calendar, genealogy did, all these kind of things. And it was designed, though, about the rule keeping, which is what you see is, of course, clearly with Pharisaism as Jesus confronted it in the gospel accounts. But here what we have is something different than that because it's beyond the law. That's what I want you to see. We're dealing with something that is Jewish in character and yet not actually necessarily rooted in the Old Testament law precisely. It moves beyond that. So you've got something that is kind of a mixture of the law itself that would be referenced in verse 16 and 17, and then things that follow that are traditions that are added to the law that really is what you hit in verses 18 and following. So that combination as a whole, they would have presented, again in this Jewish philosophy, as evidence of wisdom. Here's what happened, okay, and then we'll move on back into the text. You have a book that is essentially, I would argue, an explanation of Jewish religion as a philosophy that was worked up during the Hellenistic period to be able to justify, if you will, the Jewish claims and the Jewish approach to life, monotheism, and some of the moral grounding, and to let it exist as being valid within Hellenism. That's what you have with some of the literature. And when you see that kind of development, this fits that perfectly. Roger.
Do we make the same mistake ourselves sometimes or see the religious world trying to do that in modern society, trying to fit the things of God into society instead of the
Sure. This is called syncretism. And that practice, the Jews practiced syncretism within Hellenism during the second period Judaism, which is why you get a lot of the development. A lot of their material, I tell the guys, I compare it this way, is essentially the Jews decided to match the Greek mythology by creating their own. Okay? And if you read their material, it's very similar. It's just kind of a sanitized mythology in many ways, okay, with a Jewish emphasis. It was fitting in. It was a synthesis. It was syncretic. You also saw this in the early church as a problem because that's why you end up with, for example, the problem of governance in the church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. What are they doing before they decide to go with one bishop rule in a congregation? They're adopting a system that is all around them in the world, the Roman Empire. Okay? That's syncretism. How do you end up with all the veneration of saints? They would go out and it would be an idea of they're worshiping all these little small idols. They had the household idols, which was very much part of it. All you have to do is just transfer venerating that to this saint and we're good. Okay? That's a syncretic way of approaching getting people to accept, but in reality, you're not really changing who they are, you're changing you to allow their idea in, to expand. Okay, so it's kind of a cultural, honestly what it is, it's cultural appropriation. It's kind of what it is. All right, Tracy.
So it's where the Romans just renamed all the Greek gods, basically?
Yes.
This is what the Jews
Yes. That's a good way to put it. The Romans basically took over many aspects over time of the Greek system. The Jews couldn't just do that because they were monotheistic. So instead, that's why you ended up having them, I would argue, build up a higher, this expansive angelology. Which actually, in some of the myths that have to do, say, with the Titans, match up well with what the Jews have the angels doing in the literature. Anyway, okay, so there's your history lesson. But I want you to show it's important if we're going to understand the background and not be drawn off sides by assuming certain things about it. These are not Judaizing teachers. These are not Gnostic teachers. This is something about halfway in between. Okay, that is being addressed here. Okay, David? They're kind of something else. I mean, some have posited Essenes as a potential people because there is a little bit of philosophy involved in their work, but we haven't, especially the asceticism part. Is there a connection? Perhaps. It's hard to say because the Essenes seem to have been mainly confined to Palestine itself. Did they influence? They seem to be kind of limited influence. And especially, I'd say certainly the religion of angels part, the worship of angels part, is definitely Pharisaic rather than Essenic, is what I would say. So, good question. Yes, sir. Yeah, okay. Yes, because, and it's partly, I would argue, time frame. Because this is the first time, if I would have this being written probably 61, 62, something like that. Whereas you'd probably have, it looks like Timothy and Titus being written after release, which is a year or two later. So closer to 62, 63, before he was, as we would understand it, then re-imprisoned. And so, but notice, it's within just a few years. And so, yes, we're talking about, Titus specifically mentions Jewish fables, okay, Jewish myth as a problem. First Timothy refers to that as well. So that was part of this time frame, I would argue. This is not something that it's not generally kind of recognized, but there's a definite pattern here to it that then develops further later on, and it morphs into something else, probably around 65, I'm guessing. Okay? And then the reason for that is the upcoming Jewish rebellion is going to be my historical argument. All right. Whew. You can clear your mind now. You just need to get the essence of it, not everything, not all the facts, just the essence. You've got this philosophy, and he then tacks on and says it's empty deceit. It's a complete waste of your time. It is both. It's empty, and that is, there's nothing to this that has any kind of value whatsoever. Okay, they're selling you a bunch of empty buckets. Okay, there's nothing in it. Okay, it is deceitful. Boy, you got to know this. Okay, what's behind door number 3? Well, nothing. It's nothing. That's the nature of it. It's philosophy, so it has a presentation of as its really important wisdom. But in terms of what it actually offers you, it's completely wasted. And now the basis of it, according to the tradition of men. When you ever see that according to, is kind of, here's the foundation for it. Okay? It's not laying this down. Here's what's driving this. Here's what's supporting all this. Men's traditions. Again, Jewish. And he mentioned that later on in the chapter. So you have this tradition of men. Are there other traditions of men than Jews have? Well, sure. There are traditions now that people have in religion, and that's what is driving them. And one of the things that people talk about, when I took a course in theology, was one of the driving aspects of what you need to think about in your theology is your tradition. I'm like, no, shouldn't be. But it's kind of taking all the things you take for granted about your interpretation of Scripture that other people don't take for granted. That's the thing. Here, tradition of men is important because you go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14, there can be a tradition from God. That is, because tradition means something handed down to you, handed over to you. But who gave it to you? So the important part here is not that it was tradition itself, that you received something by tradition, it was handed over to you by somebody else. It was that it came from men. It's men's, therefore it's the best you got is men's ideas. So, you go to the source, and that's not what they were doing. That's what he is, notice how he's already characterized it. As it presents itself philosophy, what it really has to offer, ultimately contrary to what they would do in selling empty deceit, what its fundamental support system is just men's traditions. And then he adds, according to the basic principles of the world. And this goes to that unhealthy kind of practice of getting, and Sandra mentioned this earlier, but it's just kind of, you're kind of, you rely on everything around you for information. Okay? Elemental core principles, but what is it? Of the world. So he's really leaning into the sources of all this. It's men, what men are saying. It's the world, what you can get from the world information. Well, what's being left out of all this? God. Okay. By its very core, what you end up with is, and this is where he's going with all this, what makes Christianity distinct? Well, I'd say Judaism first and then Christianity distinct. They're revealed religions. It's something, whereas really when you look at what we'd say most world religions, you'd have, say, Islam makes a claim to be a revealed religion. Pretty much everything else doesn't even bother to make that claim. It is essentially a religious philosophy. When you think about Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, that's kind of the difference. Okay, it is trying to put the world all together by a philosophical means, but with some spiritual intent. He says that's not going to do it. Notice the series. According to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world. This is what it's built on. And not according to Christ. These things, these ideas they're getting are coming from men's traditions, what men have written, not what God has revealed, and from basic principles of the world, and that is information you can glean from the world around you. If all we ever did say, can you have an idea of a religious philosophy, or I'll say a quasi-religious philosophy that is built upon evolution? If you don't understand the answer is yes to that, then I'm going to say, beware. Because yes, you can. That is, the core ideas and assumptions that go into evolution then end up driving a lot of other things people have. For example, there's a reason why you have, okay, well, this is evolution, this is different. You ever heard the term social Darwinism? Okay. The Darwinic principles have been applied to almost every other facet of study in one way or another, and usually with similar results. It just kind of twists everything.
We're still trying to evolve our religion instead of
Yeah, no, that's right. Is that you got to keep up with society. Your whatever you believe needs to first of all match whatever society's beliefs are. It's got to have kind of a mores are greater than morals kind of idea to it. Keep up with the times. All those kind of things are similar on this. They were going back into the science of the day about establishing certain things. Here's what mattered. So here's what really you need to know. For them, they would have been studying, they definitely spent time studying, say, we'd say astronomy of various kinds, because they were interested in the calendar and figuring those kind of things out. Okay, so those are core elemental kind of things. And he says that they were treating as being high-end kind of important things for what they were. Not according to Christ. Here's why it makes a difference. Here's now verse 9. So we quote verse 9, but I think the context of verse 9 is really important. For in him, in Christ, dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. He's getting to, why should you listen to these other people and not to Christ? Why would you do that? Why would you pay attention to what men are saying or have said over the centuries, or give priority to something you're getting from basic science now, and you're not paying attention to those things that have come and are founded on God who came in the flesh? Again, now we have a combination of not just revealed religion, but revealed deity. Christianity, and this is, of course, what is distinct about Christianity, even in Judaism, is it's not just revealed religion, it is revealed God. Distinct. Now, the idea here, when it says, for in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, that is very different from saying, for in him dwells all of God bodily. Everyone understand the difference? To say, for in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, is very different from saying, for in him dwells all of God bodily. The word here is theotetos. Okay, so it's related, but it's the idea of deity. It's that not all, or the aspect of the divine. So you've got not all of theos, but theotetos, of that which it is to be God, if you will. Well, that matters because, of course, what we mean, what is distinct about this is Jesus is completely God. That is, he is fully in every way God, but he is not all of who is God. I'm sorry, does theology hurt? Okay. Jesus is not the Father, Jesus is not the Holy Spirit, but Jesus is God. That's right. He partakes of all the characteristics of deity, which means he is God, but that does not mean he is all of what constitutes God. Okay? So this one who has all the characteristics of being deity took that and had it in a bodily form. Incarnation. Now here it is, the fullness. That's interesting, but that's one of those words too that was regularly used in these philosophical contexts. So he uses it to refer to the fullness of the Godhead. So that is, there wasn't something missing about his identity, about divine identity, even though he took on a bodily form. Now, a bodily form, to do that, has obvious limitations because of what a bodily form is. Right? A body is a container. Right? That's what a body is. A body is a container. It has some essence of being man. If you don't have body, then you're not man. Well, he was man. But he didn't, here's the key way to, I think, important to think about this. He did not give up any aspect of being God in terms of identity when he became man. He simply added things that are uniquely man. But that had necessary consequences to what he expressed as God. Everyone want to come take my Godhead class coming up in the fall? For what he is doing now, he is confronting head on any kind of idea that Jewish philosophers might use to attack the value and worthwhile and reality of Christianity. He can't be God. He's a man. He was a man. And Paul says, those are not impossible to bring together. Jesus is proof of it. Now, the nature of the argument is different than what you would typically see with outright denial. But it is important. Fullness, everything of what it is to be God. Dwell, and that word has to have his home in a permanent sense in. And that is different than, say, a theophany, where he just took on a bodily form. No, this was a melding of the two. Bodily. All the fullness. He doesn't cease to be God in any way, because here's the thing, if he loses, if God at some point ceases to be God, could he ever have been God in the first place? The answer is no, because of the nature of eternity. Okay? He is entirely holy God in identity, but through his work takes on an additional series of characteristics by becoming man. That's not good. So, verse 10. I thought I see John's hand up, I think. Yes. Was there creation? What? What was made? Well, I mean, the same way anything else, you've got what it took to mean man. There had to be form there, right? But that was what was supplied by why there wasn't just this appearance why he had to be conceived and born, was because of the extent of what was going on here. So that there's reality. Now, it's not creation any more in the sense of which any baby is created. That is, it's based upon things that were provided for from the very beginning. So there's something new there, but the means by which are providential. Whereas to be, of course, obviously with this situation, to make what is required, which is for spirit and a body form to come together, right? What is supplied, and I guess what you're getting to in some sense is that Mary only has she's giving off half the chromosomes, right? So there had to be some provision, and that's what the Holy Spirit was doing in some way. It was providing and creating some other sense of the chromosomes to match. Is that what your question is? That sounds like the basic principles of the world, John. I'm not hearing you. Yes. But that also he's the one involved in making that happen, which that revolves around what his role was and is in terms of bringing things to complete the process. All right. Thank you for that. You know, I can go off on enough rabbit trails on my own. You know, I don't need your help, people. Verse 10. I don't like the way y'all agreed with me on that. And you are complete in him who is the head of all principality and power. Okay. Here we're back to what, if you remember, in verses like the end of chapter 1 and especially the first 5 verses of chapter 2, he is emphasizing Jesus is always enough. And and it tells you something. This is the mirroring part of your work as an exegete, is to realize that means that they were saying, hey, you're fine with all of this, but you need this too. You need our tradition kind of layered over, and our philosophy layered over what you believe about Jesus. And there's got a little bit of correction to go around with this too. Ever read the Book of Mormon? This layer is just kind of a layering over, glossing over, and offering a little few tweaks, you know, including that Jesus isn't really God. Okay? Now you've got your comp for what we're talking about, that kind of thing. You are complete in him. The word here is that this is what's beautiful about it, but it's missed. You see the word fullness in verse 9? Pleroma. The word complete is pleromenoi. It is a participle form of that noun. They're related. Okay? So it has been, having been filled up in him is the idea. He's the fullness, and you are filled up in being in a relationship with him. You're topping out. Okay? There's not any room for any more of what they want to spoon feed you. You're topped out with Jesus. You got everything you need. Okay? So in your relationship, you don't need anybody else adding in. He can provide everything you need. And then he gives this as one of the reasons why, which again is implying something about what their ideas were. Who is the head of all principality and power? I think the most important part here is head. Now, he had already been moving this direction going back to chapter 1. Remember verse 18? When he is the head of the church, right? You've got that given. Okay? He's the head of the body, which is the church. Well, here he comes back and he's once more, he is the head. Here it's of all principality and power. He is not one of many who exercise some form of rule. He is the one who has charge of and has the authority that is greater than all these others who might try to exercise authority and rule. That was really quick. Y'all are playing with me. That was not 5 minutes. I don't know. Bell guys are messing with me. I'm not sure that that's fair. Anyway, we will pick up with that next week.